Good morning, church.
Good morning.
Today is the day that you've been waiting for. Not just my birthday, but the end of the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 40 is our text for this morning. But before we read through the passage, I think it would be good for us to go through and look at what we've been studying for this past year. We've been traveling through this book. And just do a quick summary, quick overview. So, about 400 years before this point, God made a promise with Abraham that he would make him into a great nation, and that he would send his descendants into a land where they would be oppressed, mistreated, but that he would then bring them out, he would save them, and bring them into a land flowing with milk and honey, the promised land. And so what we see in the book of Exodus is that just that happens. God leads the nation of Israel, only about 70 people at the time, leads them into the land of Egypt. They set up camp there, and after a little while after Joseph and his brothers die, a new Pharaoh rises to the throne. God is greatly multiplying Israel. They're no longer just that small camp anymore. By this point, there's about 2 million people wandering the desert, so they multiplied greatly, all because of God's blessing. But the Pharaoh that rose up to the throne saw them as a potential threat. Maybe they could start a resistance or something. So he put them into forced slavery. They're responsible for a lot of the pyramids, sphinxes, different artifacts that are found in Egypt today. But throughout their time of suffering, God heard their cries for deliverance, for rescue, and he raised up a deliverer from one of their own, a man named Moses. He raised up Moses to go to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. Pharaoh, as we know, hardened his heart. He was stubborn against God, wouldn't do it. And so God sent plague after plague after plague until Pharaoh finally broke. And it was the king of Egypt who was the one who actually drove Israel out of the land. He's the one who pushed them out. But the text says that as they went, the Egyptians gave them all of their stuff. So Israel plundered the Egyptians as they were leaving. So that's where all of this gold and everything comes from whenever they're setting up the tabernacle, because they were able to plunder the Egyptians. However, it wasn't too long after that point that Pharaoh, quote, got in his right mind and realized that they had just lost their slave force. And so he gathered up all the military that he had left, chased the Israelites all the way to the Red Sea, and it was at that point that God parted the waters, allowed Israel to cross through safely. And who would follow but the Egyptian army? And as soon as the last Israelite was safe on the other side, God collapsed the water, drowned the Egyptian army, and Egypt has never been able to recover. For 3,500 years, Egypt has never been able to recover to a world empire status. God completely collapsed the nation of Egypt. And so then that brings us to the point where Israel is on the other side of the Red Sea. They look back, the water is closed, there's no way going back, so there's only one direction, and that's to move forward into a desert wilderness. And what we know about deserts, they typically don't have a lot of water, don't have a lot of food, but God provided for them. He gave them bread from heaven. He made a rock break twice and turn into a giant pool of water for them to drink. He provided for them, even though they grumbled, even though they complained over and over again. God was showing them that he's their God, he's good, and that he's the one sustaining them, that they can trust him. So this was a wilderness experience that he was bringing them through. And eventually we get to the point where God led them to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up the mountain. We remember he goes back and forth because God's not yet in the middle of the camp yet. He's still up on the mountain. So Moses goes up, and there's one instance that we talked about a few weeks ago where Moses is gone for 40 days, and Israel begins to lose hope. They begin to distrust. Maybe Moses isn't coming back. They start to worry. Anxiety is getting the best of them. And so they build themselves a golden calf that they can worship that leads them into further sin. They were planning on leaving the Lord. Moses comes down the mountain, destroys the idol. Judgment does come on the people, but God is good. He restores the people. Moses goes back up the mountain, brings down 2 more tablets, unbroken. They kind of rededicate themselves to the covenant because God is faithful to his people. And then God gives instructions on the tabernacle. And that's what we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. The instructions on how to build the tabernacle and where to set the furniture inside. And so what we're going to see in Exodus chapter 40 is there's not a whole lot of new things. Most of this has already been covered in the book. However, this is not only the completion of the book, but this is finally God telling Moses that on this specific day, set up the tabernacle, and then we're going to see that God comes and actually dwells with his people. So the work is actually finished on this day. And that's why I titled this morning's message, The Finished Work. We're going to see 3 main things going on in this passage. And I'm going to give the outline as we go through, but then I'm going to repeat it at the end because there's a neat parallel to the New Testament that I hope we can see from the passage. And so I'm going to read the first section of Exodus chapter 40. It says in verse 1, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, On the first day of the first month you shall erect the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and you shall put in the ark of the testimony, and you shall screen the ark with the veil. And you shall bring in the table and arrange it, and you shall bring in the lampstand and set up its lamps, and you shall put the golden altar for incense before the ark of the testimony, and set up the screen for the door of the tabernacle. You shall set the altar of burnt offering before the door of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and place the basin between the tent of meeting and the altar, and put water in it. And you shall set up the court all around, and hang up the screen for the gate of the court. Then you shall take the anointing oil and anoint the tabernacle and all that is in it, and consecrate it and all its furniture, so that it may become holy. You shall also anoint the altar of burnt offering and all its utensils, and consecrate the altar, so that the altar may become most holy. You shall also anoint the basin and its stand, and consecrate it. Then you shall bring Aaron and his sons to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and shall wash them with water, and put on Aaron the holy garments. And you shall appoint him and consecrate him, that he may serve me as priest. You shall bring his sons also, and put coats on them, and anoint them as you anointed their father, that they may serve me as priests. And their anointing shall admit them to a perpetual priesthood throughout their generations." So to give a little bit of context and perspective, Israel has been in the desert for exactly 1 year at this point. Just remember, Passover was the 14th day of the first month. And so this is the Lord said to Moses, saying, on the first day of the first month, you shall erect the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. So Israel has been wandering in the desert for 1 year now. And it's not too long after this point when God's actually going to lead them over to the place where they would actually cross the river. They would send out spies. We'll get to there eventually. They end up disobeying, and we kind of know how that goes. They don't actually get to inherit the land right off the bat. But they have been in the desert for 1 year. God has been teaching them to trust him in his provision. God, this whole time, has been providing manna every morning, 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. Every morning, I said that wrong. That's our week. That's our calendar. Sunday through Friday, God has been providing manna every single morning for his people. They didn't have to work for it. God just did it. He's been providing for them. Their clothes haven't worn out. He's given them water every step of the way. And now, at Mount Sinai, this has been 1 year. What are they to do? This passage talks about erecting the tabernacle, so they're going to set it up and they're going to anoint it. And so it says Moses is going to do all this. I have to imagine that Moses isn't the only one working on this. I imagine that there's a whole team, but he's supervising, he's kind of overseeing the project. However, this shows us that the tabernacle could be set up in 1 day, a matter of hours maybe, which is good because at the end of this chapter we're going to see how God came. Whenever it's actually set up, God comes, he dwells in the tabernacle. And whenever he's dwelling in the tabernacle, the people don't move. They're just to stay put, to stay there. But whenever he lifts up back into the sky, then they bring up the tabernacle, they unpiece everything, and then they carry it. They walk wherever the Lord leads them, then they'll set it up wherever he leads. So it doesn't take very long for them to set it up, take it down. And so this is the first thing we see here, is that God gave exact instructions for how the work was to be done. Chapter 40, verses 1 through 15, God gave exact instructions for how the work was to be done. God is very specific, as we've seen throughout the book of Exodus and throughout the whole Bible. None of God's word is vague. None of it is ambiguous. There may be things in here that we can't fully know because we're limited, but all of God's word can be truly known. We can know God. We can know his word. And all of this has been reiterated. It's been expounded on throughout the book of Exodus. So God gave exact instructions for how the work was to be done. So I would like to ask you, are you listening to the Lord? Because his word is very clear. It was clear to Moses, and it's clear to us today. Are you listening to the Lord? Are you leaving a lasting impact on your kids, grandkids, one that will have eternal implications for their lives? We may not be setting up a priesthood like Aaron and his sons were, but the point of this is, are we passing this on to the next generation? Our faith, our love for God, can they see that in us? And are they going to have the same fire, maybe even greater than we have? So are we listening to the Lord in his commands? Going on to verse 16, it says, "This Moses did according to all that the Lord commanded him. So he did. In the first month, in the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was erected. Moses erected the tabernacle. He laid its bases and set up its frames and put in its poles and raised up its pillars. And he spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering of the tent over it, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He took the testimony and put it into the ark, and put the poles on the ark, and set the mercy seat above on the ark. And he brought the ark into the tabernacle, and set up the veil of the screen, and screened the ark of the testimony, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put the table in the tent of meeting in the north side of the tabernacle, outside the veil, and arranged the bread on it before the Lord, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put the lampstand in the tent of meeting opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle, and set up the lamps before the Lord, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put the golden altar in the tent of meeting before the veil, and burned fragrant incense on it, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put in place the screen for the door of the tabernacle, and he set the altar of burnt offering at the entrance of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and offered on it the burnt offering and the grain offering, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He set the basin between the tent of meeting and the altar, and put water in it for washing, with which Moses and Aaron and his sons washed their hands and their feet. When they went into the tent of meeting, and when they approached the altar, they washed as the Lord commanded Moses. And he erected the court around the tabernacle and the altar, and set up the screen of the gate of the court. So Moses finished the work. What we see here is that the servant, we're talking about Moses here, but the servant obeyed those instructions and finished his work. And so the first thing we saw was that God gave exact instructions for how the work was to be done. And the second thing right here is the servant obeyed those instructions and finished his work. Moses obeyed God's word to the letter. It says over and over again, and Moses did as the Lord commanded. Moses did as the Lord commanded. Moses obeyed God, the exact instructions that he gave. And he began it and he finished it. You see, Israel, up to this point, had been grumbling, complaining. They made a calf over and over again. In reality, they failed. And if it was up to them, they wouldn't have finished. They wouldn't have gotten to this point. The tabernacle wouldn't have been completed. But it was because God was leading them. God was in charge of whether or not his people would finish. And he's in charge of us too, whether or not we will finish. Philippians 1:6 says, I have it marked here actually. And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. See, our God is a finishing God. He doesn't just start things, he finishes it. And we were laughing at one point. We were filling out an application for school a few years ago. It had to be this whole evaluation. And one of the things was, are you a self-starter? And I asked Caitlin, I turned to her, and I was like, would you consider me to be a self-starter? And she started laughing. Because I start things all the time. When we first got married, for like the first 3 months, I was determined to learn Greek. It didn't really work. But I would get up at like 2 in the morning and stay up for like 3 or 4 hours trying to learn Greek before class. And then after that, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed my rest. I needed to sleep, and I lost everything that I had just learned. I'll start a workout. I'll say, oh yeah, I'm going to start working out, like do some arm muscles and stuff. And 3 days later, I'm sitting on the couch eating chips. And you laugh because you've done it. But we do that. I worked at Krispy Kreme, and it got really slow the first week of January. And I asked my boss why, and he said, oh, it does this every year. People make New Year's resolutions, and then they don't follow through with them. The third week of January, business had picked up. Actually, it was even faster than what it had been. But learning Greek and Hebrew, now I've actually gotten a chance to do that in class at seminary at Grace. And what I learned through Greek and what I'm learning through Hebrew right now is that I don't think I would have made it if I was on my own. You see, I made this comment to a couple people last year about Greek and how I was struggling through it. And I did get through it. I am here. I survived. But it was because of my teacher who just kind of kept progressing. And I had to keep with him. And it was because of him, though. He was determined that I finish with him and that the class finishes with him. And so I want to try and relate that to this. If it was up to Israel, they wouldn't have made it to this point. They wouldn't have finished the tabernacle. But it wasn't up to Israel, it was up to God. And if it's up to us in our own lives, we wouldn't make it. But it's not up to us. We have a part. I don't want to diminish that. But God is heavily involved in our lives. And he will make sure, what that Philippians passage said, he will make sure that he will complete us. That was the song that was playing on the radio this morning. And we're not alone in this. God is working us to completion. And so are you not just listening to the Lord, are you obeying him? Again, his word is very clear. It's not vague, it's not ambiguous. It's right here. And are you faithfully fulfilling the assignment that God has given you to do? Business meetings like we had last week, I don't know if there's anybody who just says yes, a business meeting. Like, I love those. It just gets joy from those. But I was actually really encouraged last week when we were sitting in our business meeting. I got to see everybody working together. I even got to see Barry and Candy stood up and mentioned that they wanted to make postcards to send out to like a 1.5 mile radius of this church. And that was just super encouraging. Gave me great joy to see we are, as a body, taking ownership, taking responsibility of what God has given to us. And I don't know about you, but I left really encouraged about that. And the Lord has different assignments for each one of us. That may be their assignment that the Lord's put on their heart. He might put something else on your heart. We were at Culver's yesterday, one of our favorite restaurants. But anyway, we were leaving, and I saw a man with a veteran hat, and it said Vietnam on it. And we went to go refill our cups of soda. And I thought, I should go say thank you. I don't know why. I don't know. But it was just something I felt like the Lord put on my heart. So I went back over real fast right before we left. And I just told him, I just want to thank you serving our country. And, it wasn't anything long. He said thanks, and I walked away. That was pretty much it. But I just felt, I should do that. I'm not sure how often he hears that. But I am thankful, and especially since Sunday was Veterans Day. But anyway, God started this passage. He gave exact instructions for how the work was to be done, and then the servant obeyed those instructions. He finished his work. So I'm a good self-starter, but I have to be honest, finishing things is a struggle for me. I'm not always the best at it. But the goal is to be like God. That's what we talk about. We want to be more godly, God-like. It's a good thing to be more like God. God, everything he starts, he finishes. I used to hear growing up, I'm sure many of you have said it, never quit something, always see it to the end. And I have to say, I haven't heard that statement in years, probably. And I don't know if it's sound advice for every example, but I wish I heard it more, actually. I think there's something good to say about the challenge of working your way through something painful, a trial, a tribulation, not quitting, not giving up, but persevering, even through the hard times. And Moses persevered with these people. He loved these people, and they actually finished the work. Verse 34 says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel, throughout all their journeys." God was always with them. We just talked about Israel made a golden calf, committed idolatry, committed perverse sins, gluttony. You could probably name the sin, and they did it twice. They grumbled and complained the whole way through. And you know what God didn't do? He didn't leave. He stayed there. He actually moved in further. He got closer to the people. In spite of their sin, he got closer to these people because he loves these people. And I have to imagine that he does the same for us. When we try to pull away in our own lives, God's always extending his hand. There's a doctrine, this is just off the cuff, so I want to be careful with what I say, but there's a doctrine, it's called perseverance of the saints. Basically, it just means that if you're saved, you'll continue to be faithful to the end. I don't really like the name. I think it should be the perseverance of God for us. It has been said another way, preservation of the saints, but basically putting the emphasis on God. I mean, how many times in my own life, maybe you can think of examples when we have sin that comes up over and over and over again. It could be the same sin that we wrestle with day in and day out, and yet God is faithful, never leaves us. We're the ones who walk away. We're the ones who leave, and at times want to leave. But the evidence that God hasn't left us is that we're right here. He's always persevering for us, even when we don't. And so this last thing, after the whole job was complete, the cloud of God's glorious presence came down to dwell with his people. The cloud was on the mountain. God came down to dwell with his people. His presence in the middle of his people. The tabernacle was set up right in the middle of the camp. And God was no longer on the mountain. He was no longer outside the camp. He moved in. So are you listening to the Lord? Are you obeying His word? Are you following Him? Are you trusting Him? The outline, I just want to read over it a couple times, and I want you to think about just a similarity that's kind of struck my attention whenever I was going over it this week. So I'm just going to read it. This is what we see in this passage. God gave exact instructions for how the work was to be done. The servant obeyed those instructions and finished his work. The cloud of God's glorious presence came down to dwell with his people. I'm going to read it one more time. God gave exact instructions for how the work was to be done. The servant obeyed those instructions and finished his work. And when the job was complete, the cloud of God's glorious presence came down to dwell with his people. And I don't know if that stirs anything in your mind, but it did me. Because think about when Jesus came onto the scene. In John chapter 17, verse 4, Jesus said to the Father, he's praying to the Father, I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. We learn in Philippians that Jesus is the suffering servant. He's our servant king. And what happened on the day of Pentecost after Jesus died, rose again, and then ascended to heaven? The Spirit of God came to dwell with his people. So the Father gave exact instructions. The servant obeyed every one of those to the word, obeyed the Father. And then the Spirit came and now dwells among his people. And he's not just in this room, he's in each one of us. We are together as the body of Christ, the temple of the Holy Spirit. And God created us for good works. And so the main idea, the main thing that I'd like to leave you with is to finish what you start. If you set your mind on something, finish it. That's something that I have to work on. I'm not perfect at it. But we have a finishing God. He doesn't just start something and then give up on it. Israel's on hold right now, but he's coming back to handle Israel and to work with them. He's not done with them yet because he doesn't give up on people and he doesn't give up on things. Anything he sets his mind on, he continues it. What we see in the end of Revelation, I actually taught on that here in May, I think it was. At the very end, what happens? God's dwelling with his people. That's the end picture. There's an intimate bond that we will have even greater than right now. We will see God face to face. So, finish what you start. If you start something, set your mind to fulfill it. Actually accomplish it. With that said, let me pray.